Good morning, everybody. The last questioner was raising which E word should we use? Environment, ecology. Where I come from, all the E words are bad. Ecology, environment, evolution. You don't have very complicated problems. What I'm going to talk on this morning for the next few minutes is, in some ways, I hope, eventually going to lead to a bigger project to take up two simple words, democracy and nature, and to consider their historic connection. I decided this morning to take the hardest case I could make for this connection. I could have talked about toxic waste, urban environmental justice, global change, but I'm going to deliberately talk about nature out there, wildness, wilderness. If I can make a case here, I suppose I can make all the other cases. That'll be fairly easy. The struggle to protect nature from human exploitation goes on all over the planet today, from Brazil to Zimbabwe, but we still have not explained fully why people care. One set of explanations derives from examples like Ashoka, the ancient ruler of India, who I believe was the first to set aside a piece of land as a wildlife preserve. I believe this happened after, and perhaps Don up here could verify or correct me, after he'd converted to Buddhism and the doctrine of nonviolence. His examples suggest either that religion has been the driving force behind such preservation, or that powerful elites, emperors, deserve credit for protecting the natural world. Both of these explanations can claim a degree of truth, but the most active nations in nature protection, it seems to me, have not been especially devoted to Buddha or other traditional deities, while most elites, from emperors to modern corporate executives, have been destructive to or indifferent to nature. On the other hand, ordinary people, whether conventionally religious or not, have often found delight in the smell of a forest or the sight of a wild antelope. The protection of nature owes much to them too, and I will argue that they have been far more important than historians have commonly acknowledged. We have not fully appreciated how much the protection of nature owes to the rise of modern liberal democracy, the ideals of liberalism and democracy, and to the support of millions of ordinary people around the world. Fortunately for a world undergoing a democratic revolution, there is plenty of wild nature left to protect. In 1989, a global survey, found 48 million square kilometers of the planet qualifying as wilderness. That's about a third of the total land surface. That's equivalent to 12 billion acres, or an expanse larger than the Western Hemisphere. This survey looked for areas larger than 1 million acres, plots of land larger than 1 million, that lacked, and this is its definition, we can go on and on about these definitions, lacking any permanent human settlement or roads, lands that were not regularly cultivated or heavily and continually grazed, but that might have been lightly used and occupied by indigenous peoples at various times who practiced traditional subsistence styles of life. Now, I know there are wilderness purists who would not find that adequate. I mean, it's too loose a standard. A dropped Kleenex on a trail disqualifies it for some people as wilderness, or the sight of a lone donkey track. On the other hand, for people who are opposed to any strict preservation, even the light passage of a primitive tribe through the landscape should disqualify it from the category of wilderness. And without much analysis, they want to put it in the category of well-used or managed place, obviously open to further exploitation. From my point of view, neither kind of absolutism will do. neither reflects the flexible, pragmatic kinds of definitions that people have historically used, or the inescapable relativity of the term. The United States, despite its persistent frontier image that Larry just alluded to, rank low on the list of wilderness-rich countries, down at number 16. Higher on the list were Russia, Canada, Australia, Brazil, the Sudan, Algeria. Several heavily populated countries were surprisingly high on the list, including China, India, Laos, Mexico. I'm getting a lot of wonderful musical accompaniment there this morning. It's sort of, if I could time it so that I could have the proper musical interlude. For example, China, despite over 1 billion population, still had, according to the survey, it's a loose standard, but 22% of its territory in a wild state, a far higher percentage than the United States, because most of this is stark desert or high mountain country. A survey that focuses on such large parcels, 1 million acre parcel as a definition, of course, does not exhaust the possibilities of wild places on the earth. There are places much, much smaller than that, pieces of wildness that lurk on the edges of our backyards, or cities, our farms, and that may be wonderfully rich in diversity and full of spiritual and aesthetic value. Where the United States stands high among the nations, and where it might even be called exceptional, is not so much in the extent of its remaining wildlands as in its long history of activism in protecting them. The U.S. was the first nation to create a national park. That was in 1872 with Yellowstone. The first to set up a full-blown wilderness preservation system in 1964, and the first to pass an Endangered Species Act in 1973. That historic role of leadership seems to have come abruptly to an end following the departure of the Clinton presidency, which in one magnificent moment declared nearly 60 million acres of U.S. forest lands to be forever free of roads. That ruling was quickly suspended by the current administration. In recent years, the cause of wildlands protection has been rejected on the political right for stifling private enterprise, and it has been criticized by some on the political left for detracting attention from issues of social justice. As a consequence, leadership in nature protection has passed to other nations, some of which are the older democracies, other parts of the world, while others are relatively younger nations still struggling to transfer power to the people and to make nature preservation a part of their culture. That shift in leadership was noticeable in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio, when the United States took a back seat as over 100 nations agreed that every country should protect at least 12% of its land base from economic use. Not every nation voting at that meeting was a full-fledged democracy, but I believe that the decision was one that reflected a democratic process of open discussion, global representation. It was animated by an egalitarian purpose to protect the beauty, health, and integrity of nature for the sake of future human generations, and to recognize a moral obligation to save other forms of life from exploitation and from extinction. In other words, preservationists from all over the world have agreed on a common program to set up protective zones where farming, logging, mining, wildlife poaching, dumping of waste is prohibited or severely restricted. They have represented a wide array of ethnic backgrounds and languages. The Nordic countries, for example, have been strong leaders, producing plenty of activists, and can boast some of the most carefully protected wildlands in the world. But thousands of miles away, and sharply contrasting in many ways, is Costa Rica, which has protected 28% of its territory from development, 11% in national parks, 4% in indigenous reserves, and 13% in a miscellaneous series of biological reserves, national forests, national monuments, and national wildlife refuges. Next door, Panama, in its post-Noriega period, is moving toward a similar policy of large-scale, vigorous nature protection. And what joins these two Central American countries to Norway or Finland or Sweden? Or joins any of them to New Zealand and its great protected wilderness of Milford Sound? On the other hand, why are so many other nations so backward in preserving wild places? Russia, for example, or Guatemala. The conventional answer is that preserving nature appeals only to affluent people whose stomachs are full and overrunning. Well, that's a bad image, isn't it? That it's never important to the poor or the ordinary or the merely aspiring. At the extremes, this seems to be true. Desperately hungry men and women in refugee camps or on the streets of Mumbai are not likely to think much about wilderness, or indeed think much about many other large issues at the national or global scale. But such an economic explanation is too simplistic and reductive to be dependable. Income alone does not work very well within societies in predicting which citizens care about preservation and which do not. It cannot explain why some oil company executives care while plenty of others do not, nor on the other hand why some pensioners care and others do not. Nor does a simple economic explanation work very well at the international level. According to World Bank data from 2003, Norway, one of the most active countries in wildlands protection, stands third in the world in gross national income per capita. That seems to confirm the idea. Finland, 13th on the list. New Zealand, 40th. Not a particularly affluent country by world standards today. Costa Rica, 77th. Panama, 79th, with a per capita income of about $4,000 a year. Huge differences in wealth, yet all are active countries in nature, awareness, and preservation. A more reliable indicator of whether nations become active in producing wild places is the state of personal freedom, the degree of social equality, and the sanctity of human rights. Far more than religious or ethnic identity or gross national product, the quality of nature protection seems to correlate with the quality of democracy. Countries where there is a more equitable distribution of economic opportunity, a low level of militarism, high levels of literacy, greater racial and gender equality, free and competitive elections, and tolerance of dissent. Nations that show these characteristics tend to set aside significant pieces of nature for protection from economic development. Why this will be the case would require me the rest of the day to explore, but let's be brief and try to get right to the point. The history and meaning of liberal democracy is an old and complicated subject. We've come to realize that it refers to more than the superficial mechanics of political modernization, elections, parliaments, governmental checks and balances, that liberal democracy is founded on ideals, values if you like, particularly a pair of intertwined cultural ideals, personal liberty and social equality. The greatest proponent of those ideals was the 18th century philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who insisted that one ideal could not exist without the other. That is, a government that promised equality to its citizens would never deliver without the constant pressure of free, critical, and dissenting opinion. Equality needed liberty, and liberty needed equality. A lot of people have tried to separate these, etc. But the two ideals have worked together to change the course of Western history, and increasingly to change the dynamics of non-Western societies as well. A lot has been written on how this pair of ideals has revolutionized human relations, but rather less on how they have affected people's relation to nature. Their environmental impact has been little short of revolutionary, too. Old notions that humans have been created especially in the image of God, or that they have been given dominion over other forms of life, or that we can draw a rigid line around our own liberty and equality, making these ideals exclusive to Homo sapiens, have proved unsustainable. Again and again, these lines have been challenged and broken down. Nature, in fact, has become the patron and the partner of liberal democracy. It has even come to be seen as the source of human liberation, a place of freedom and equality, and therefore worthy of respect, protection, even worship. I wish to speak a word for nature, declared Henry David Thoreau in 1862, for absolute freedom and wildness as contrasted with a freedom and culture merely civil. Going into wild country, yes, out there, although it may be in the back corner of your backyard, experiencing places free of human domination becomes a way of freeing oneself from the hand of convention or authority. Social deference fades in the wilderness. Economic rank does not matter so much. Money is not needed to survive there. Nature offers a home to the dissident mind, the rebellious child, the outlaw, the runaway slave, the soldier who refused to fight, and by the late 19th century, the woman who went mountain climbing to show her strength and independence. A move towards greater equality among species became irresistible too, giving rise to animal rights, wildlife refuges, and even Darwin's theory of evolution, which joined humans and other forms of life into a common brother-sisterhood. Plants and animals came to be valued for more than their potential for domestication, their fitness for pulling a wagon or yielding a crop. Wild species came to be admired for surviving on their own, independent of human purposes. I mean, how would we get Moby Dick without liberal democracy? Maybe a thought experiment, but it was a thought experiment that seems to be deeply rooted in these broader cultural and, in a sense, political changes going on. Species were seen to form their own communities. They were not inferior versions of ourselves, but beings created by God or evolving by natural processes for their own sake. They were, as John Muir argued, earth-born companions and our fellow mortals. Nature, in the wake of liberal democracy, also became the basis of a new, or perhaps it's a rediscovered religion, a fathomless source of spirituality, complementary to, or even independent of, traditional religion. Woods, mountains, prairies became divine texts in which one could find answers to life's ultimate questions without the mediation, and this is the crucial part, without the mediation of church authorities or theologians, perhaps even divinity schools. Any written Bible or Testament came to be seen, at least in advanced circles, not in Kansas particularly, although there are, wherever you go. I grew up in a Protestant fundamentalist church, so I know what it means to liberate oneself from written Bibles and Testaments, which came to be seen as man-made artifacts full of human frailties and limitations, inferior to the outdoors as a source of inspiration. Nature drew people away from all established creeds and faiths. In the presence of nature, the rising liberal spirit of the 19th and 20th centuries found a new source of guidance accessible to any individual. One of the great pioneers of that new religion of nature was none other than Rousseau. In 1762, both the French and the Swiss government threatened him with arrest for being a dangerous heretic, a radical, an anti-Christian. Seeking refuge from the authorities on St. Pierre's Island near Bern, Switzerland, he immersed himself, body and mind, in the wholeness of nature. His memoir, The Reveries of the Solitary Walker, tells about finding a subversive source of religious insight. And I want to quote from that text. The earth, in the harmony of the three realms, mineral, plant, animal, offers man a spectacle filled with life, interest, and charm. This is 1762. The only spectacle in the world of which his eyes and his heart never weary. The more sensitive a soul a contemplator has, the more he gives himself up to the ecstasies this harmony arouses in him. A sweet and deep reverie takes possession of his senses, and through a delightful intoxication he loses himself in the immensity of this beautiful system with which he feels himself one. We could go on finding the legacy that this left behind, people who have felt the call of nature: Wordsworth, Goethe, Rachel Carson, Alda Leopold, Robert Marshall, to speak only mainly in the case of the United States. Whatever their national or religious roots, they have broken free from orthodoxy and found in nature part or whole of what they need to feed their spiritual hunger. I think even evangelical Protestantism has been deeply affected by this architecture of churches in ways that we have still not fully accounted for, and even conservatives. Barry Goldwater expresses some of this, talking about the deserts of Arizona, Mr. Conservative. If the nature protection movement has risen in the wake of liberal democracy, and I believe it has, influenced deeply by these ideals of liberty and equality, then we should not expect to find that movement blooming in places where repressive authority and inequality stand in the way. We should not expect a preservation ethic to flourish in a man like Somoza, the dictatorial president of Nicaragua in the 1940s and 50s, or Colonel Mobutu, the kleptocratic strongman of Zaire until he was deposed in 1997, or in such totalitarians as Chairman Mao, Stalin, Pol Pot. We should not be surprised that wildlands are not attractive to people like this, to military juntas, theocracies, patriarchs, or slave regimes. Nature in its wilder state is a threat to the authoritarian mind. It is where danger lurks, threatening to erupt and bring down their edifices of control. We should expect, on the other hand, that nations in the forefront of nature preservation would be those influenced by the ideals of liberty and equality, and indeed, that is so. Costa Rica and Panama in Central America, New Zealand and Australia in the South Pacific, the United States and Canada in North America, Norway, Scotland, and others in Europe, and eventually Bulgaria, Chile, India, Zambia. Liberal democracies are, of course, more than expressions of cultural ideals. They are also systems of governments, and to do that work, they pass laws and regulations. They infringe on the liberty of some individuals in order to protect the liberties of others, or to protect the spiritual values of wilderness, or the rights of other species to survive. This rule-making can lead to charges of injustice, and sometimes the charges are justified. Liberal democracies, in making laws and regulations, have not been free of class, gender, or racial bias, or always respectful of differences of opinion. They are imperfect creations. Alexis de Tocqueville rightly warned about some of their shortcomings. A tendency toward tyranny of the majority, a tendency to glorify greed, a susceptibility to new elites, gaining power through the free accumulation of money. Those who demand their own freedom can be quick to deny it to others. This is, I think, as clear a lesson from history as we can find in every country on the face of the earth. Despite Rousseau's confidence that virtue must always flourish where liberty and equality together flourish, history shows a more complicated picture. liberal democracies that show this hypocrisy along with virtue, conflict as well as cooperation, and bigotry of all sorts. These contradictions, I think, have driven much of modern history. It is precisely because of them, the contradictions, the tension between liberty and equality, between present and future generations, between human rights and nature's right to exist, that liberal democracies do not represent some ultimate or unstoppable victory. They are not, at least in their current forms, the end of history. The most serious challenges facing conservationists are those regimes that have never been touched by or are falling back from liberal democratic ideals. They are many, and they control the destiny of much of the remaining wild places on the planet. Some are still locked in repressive attitudes that allow no dissent from orthodoxy, no openness to new ideas or research, and no respect for the other-than-human world. And then there is the challenge of nations where liberal democracy is weakening or failing, as authoritarian sources within them gain strength. They too are not hard to find. Look for imperial-scale military budgets, social intolerance, education giving way to indoctrination, oil drilling in the last wild places, and dark warnings against pagan heresies. Perhaps this is the way that the dream of liberal democracy self-destructs. That is, in their quest for freedom and equality, people may devour the earth before they save it. And in devouring the earth, they may lose the freedom they thought they were getting. They may end up as slaves to their own appetites. They may live in a fearful bondage to whatever ideas or forces will offer them security. That seems to describe accurately the current mood of many Americans and others around the world. But, and this is my conclusion, this historic association of nature protection with the spread of liberty and equality has been a strong force, one of the strongest in history. It has reached into almost every corner of this imperiled planet. That association is not dead. I'm no prophet. I can't predict where it's going to go. But it is certainly continuing to push nations toward a global ethic of conservation. Thank you.